All right, we have made it to part 3 of Unbroken. So we're going to read chapter 12 today, which is on page 131. It's called Downed. It's a pretty short chapter, won't take us too long to read. And I'm going to keep the document camera super zoomed in so that hopefully you can follow along. If you follow along while you listen to someone reading, it helps your reading fluency, just kind of the flow. And it'll also help you to remember some of these tricky vocab words. So if you can see on your little screen, please follow along. And here we go, down to chapter 12. The ocean was a jumble of bomber remains. The lifeblood of the plane, oil, hydraulic fluid, and some 1,000 gallons of fuel slopped about on the surface. Curling among the bits of plane were threads of blood. I should pause there and remind you that at the end of chapter 11, Louis just survived a plane crash. The plane went down. He was sinking and drowning and had fuselage, plane bits all around him, and then he miraculously was able to escape. His Mae West, or his life jacket, raised him up to the surface, and he survived. And that's where we're at. Louis heard a voice. He turned toward it and saw Phil, a few dozen feet away, clinging to what looked like a fuel tank. With him was the tail gunner, Mac. Neither man had a Mae West or life jacket on. Blood spouted in rhythmic arcs from Phil's head and washed in sheets down his face. His eyes rolled about in dazed bewilderment. Phil looked at the head bobbing across the debris-filled and registered that it was Louis. None of the other men had surfaced. Louis saw one of the life rafts bobbing on the water. It was possible that the raft had been thrown loose by the disintegrating plane, but it was much more likely that the engineer, in the last act of his life, had yanked the raft release handle just before the crash. The raft had inflated itself and was drifting away rapidly. Louis knew that he had to get Phil's bleeding stopped, but if he went to him, the raft would be lost and all of them would perish. He swam for the raft. His clothing and shoes weighed him down, and the current and wind carried the raft away faster than he could swim. As it slipped farther and farther from reach, Louis gave up. He looked back at Phil and Mac, sharing the recognition that their chance was lost. Then he saw a long cord trailing off the raft, snaking not 2 feet from his face. He snatched the cord, reeled the raft to him, and climbed aboard. A second raft was sliding away. Louis pulled out his raft's oars, rowed as hard as he could, and just managed to catch the cord and pull the raft to him. He fed the cords through the grommets in the rafts and tied them together. He rowed to Phil and Mac. Realizing that the jagged hunk that he was clinging to might perforate the rafts, Phil pushed it away. Louis pulled Phil aboard, and Mac climbed up under his own power. Both men, like Louis, were filmy with fuel and oil. With all 3 of them in one raft, it was cramped. The raft was only about 6 feet long inside and a little more than 2 feet wide. There were 2 gashes on the left side of Phil's forehead by the hairline. Blood was spurting from the wounds and mixed with seawater sloshing in the bottom of the raft. Remembering what he had learned in Boy Scouts and his Honolulu first aid course, Louis ran his fingers down Phil's throat until he felt a pulse, the carotid artery, and realizing here that Phil is bleeding too much to survive. So Louis is going to try and do some first aid to try and slow or stop the bleeding. He showed Mac the spot and told him to press down. He pulled off his muslin top shirt and t-shirt and pulled Phil's shirts off as well. He asked Mac to do the same. Setting aside the top shirts, Louis dipped Phil's t-shirt in the water, folded it into a compress, and pressed it to the wounds. He took the other t-shirts and tied them tightly around Phil's head, then slid Phil into the second raft. Phil's mind was woozy. He knew that he'd crashed, that someone had pulled him from the water, that he was in a raft, and that Louis was with him. He felt frightened, though not panicked. As the pilot, he was officially in command, but he grasped his situation well enough to know that he was in no condition to make decisions. He could see that Louis had a nasty cut on his finger near his USC ring, but was otherwise unhurt and lucid. He asked Louis to take command, and Louis agreed. "I'm glad it was you, Zamp," Phil said softly. Remember, Louis' last name is Zamperini. Then he fell quiet. From somewhere nearby there was a small sound, a moan trailing off into a gargle, a mouth trying to form a word, a throat filling with water, then silence. Louis grabbed an oar and circled around as rapidly as he could, searching for the drowning man. Maybe it was Cuppernell, who hadn't been seen since he was deep underwater. They would never know. Whoever had made the sound had slipped under. He didn't come up again. With Phil relatively stable, Louis turned his attention to the rafts. Made of 2 layers of canvas coated in rubber and divided into 2 air pockets bisected by a bulkhead, each was in good condition. The critical question regarded provisions. The provisions box, which Mac had been holding as the plane went down, was gone, either ripped from his hands during the crash or lost in his escape from the wreckage. In their pockets, the men had only wallets and a few coins. Their watches were still on their wrists, but the hands had stopped when the plane had hit the water. Probably for the first time since Phil had arrived in Oahu, Cece's lucky bracelet wasn't on his wrist, and the silver dollar he'd been keeping for his reunion with her wasn't in his pocket. Maybe in the hurry to dress for the flight he had forgotten them, or maybe they'd been lost in the crash. Pockets in the raft contained some survival provisions. Whatever was in them was all that they'd have. Louis untied the pocket flaps and looked inside. He found several thick chocolate bars, probably Hershey's military-issue Ration D bars, divided into segments and packaged in wax-dipped containers to resist gas attack. Designed to be unpalatably bitter or nasty tasting, so soldiers would eat them only in dire circumstances or really bad circumstances. They were formulated to be highly caloric, calories, and melt resistant. So they taste bad so that you won't eat them unless you absolutely have to. But also it's supposed to give you a lot of calories, so these chocolate bars will help you to survive. The package instructions said that each man was to be given 2 segments a day, 1 in the morning, 1 in the evening, to be held on the tongue and allowed to dissolve over 30 minutes. So these little 2 pieces of chocolate bars are supposed to help you survive for as long as possible. With the chocolate, Louis found several half-pint tins of water, a brass mirror, a flare gun, sea dye, a set of fish hooks, a spool of fishing line, and 2 air pumps in canvas cases. There was also a set of pliers with a screwdriver built into the handle. Louis pondered it for a long while, trying to come up with a reason why someone would need a screwdriver or pliers on a raft. Each raft also had a patch kit to be used if the raft leaked. That was all there was. The provisions were grossly inadequate, meaning not good enough. 1 year later, each B-24 raft would be equipped with a sun tarpaulin for shade, blue on one side, yellow on the other. For camouflage in enemy waters, the tarpaulin could be spread blue side up for signaling. The yellow side could be waved. Each standard 1944 raft would also be equipped with a bailing bucket, a mast and sail, a sea anchor, sun ointment, first aid kit, puncture plugs, a flashlight, fishing tackle, a jackknife, scissors, a whistle, a compass, and religious pamphlets. None of these items, not even a knife, was in Green Hornet's rafts. So basically it's saying later they would learn that these rafts needed to have a lot more supplies, but in the meantime for Louis it has basically nothing useful. The rafts also had no Gibson Girl, a radio transmitter that could send signals over some 200 miles. Newer planes had been carrying them for nearly a year, and in 2 months all planes would be equipped. But Green Hornet hadn't been furnished with one, and they had no navigation instruments. It had been Mitchell's job to strap them to his body, but if he had done so, the instruments had gone to the bottom with him. Most worrisome was the water situation. A few half-pints wouldn't last them long. The men were surrounded by water, but they couldn't drink it. The salt content in seawater is so high that it's considered a poison. When a person drinks seawater, the kidneys must generate urine to flush the salt away. But to do so, they need more water than is contained in the seawater itself, so the body pulls water from its cells. Bereft of water, or without water, the cells begin to fail. Paradoxically, a drink of seawater causes potentially fatal dehydration. So even though they're surrounded by water, they're nervous that they won't survive if they drink it, because they'll run out of water. Adrift near the equator with little water and no shelter, Phil, Louis, and Mac would soon be in dire trouble, or in great trouble. The rafts hadn't been equipped with water desalinizing or distilling materials, so they don't have a way to get the salt out of the water, nor did they have containers in which to catch rain. 5 months earlier, General Hap Arnold had ordered that all life rafts be equipped with Delano Sunstill, a device that could generate small amounts of drinking water indefinitely. But delivery had been delayed. From the moment that he had come out of the water, Mac hadn't said a word. He had somehow escaped the crash without injury. He had done everything that Louis had asked of him, but his face had never lost its glazed, startled expression. Louis was bent over the raft when Mac suddenly began wailing. "We're going to die!" Louis reassured him that the squadron would come for them, that they were likely to be found that night, at the latest the next day. Mac continued to shout. Louis, exasperated, threatened to report Mac when they returned. It had no effect. At his wit's end, Louis whacked Mac across the cheek with the back of his hand. Mac thumped back and fell silent. Louis came up with ground rules. Each man would eat 1 square of chocolate in the morning, 1 in the evening. Louis allotted 1 water tin per man, with each man allowed 2 or 3 sips a day. Eating and drinking at this rate, they would stretch out their supplies for a few days. With inventory taken and rules established, there was nothing to do but wait. Louis was in pain. He knew his back had been badly scraped as he had escaped the wreckage, and he assumed this was the source of the pain. He had no idea that he was hurt much more seriously than that. When the plane had hit the water and he'd been thrown into the gun mount, all of his ribs had broken. Louis made a deliberate effort to avoid thinking about the men who had died, and had to push away the memory of the gurgling voice in the water. Considering the crash, he was amazed that the 3 men had survived. All 3 had been on the plane's right side. The fact that the plane had struck on its left had probably saved them. What mystified Louis was his escape from the wreckage. If he had passed out from the pressure, and the plane had continued to sink and the pressure to build, why had he woken again? And how had he been loosed from the wires while unconscious? Note this, because this is going to be something that reoccurs throughout the book, that Louis will be in these situations where he doesn't think he should have survived, and he somehow miraculously keeps going. And that's going to be something that, especially later on, he will come to notice and talk about. The men watched the sky. Louis kept his hand on Phil's head, stanching the bleeding, or trying to stop the bleeding. The last trace of Green Hornet, the shimmer of gas, hydraulic fluid, and oil that had wreathed the raft since the crash, faded away. In its place, rising from below, came dark blue shapes, gliding in lithe or smooth arcs. A neat, sharp form, flat and shining, cut the surface, and began tracing circles around the rafts. Another one joined it. The sharks had found them. Fluttering close to their sides were pilot fish, striped black and white. The sharks, which Louis thought were of the mako and reef species, were so close that the men would only have to extend their hands to touch them. The smallest were about 6 feet long, some were double that size. They bent around the rafts, testing the fabric, dragging their fins along them, but not trying to get at the men on top. They seemed to be waiting for the men to come to them. So picture this, they've just survived a terrible plane crash. They've lost most of their crew except for the 3 men. They realize that they can only survive a few days, and now there's sharks circling, just waiting to eat them. This does not feel great for Louis. The sun sank, and it became sharply cold. The men used their hands to bail a few inches of water into each life raft. Once their bodies warmed the water, they felt less chilled. Though exhausted, they fought the urge to sleep, afraid that a ship or submarine would pass and they'd miss it. Phil's lower body under the water was warm enough, but his upper body was so cold that he shook. Remember, Phil's badly injured and bleeding, so his body's going into shock. It was absolutely dark and absolutely silent, save for the chattering of Phil's teeth. The ocean was a flat calm. A rough, rasping tremor ran through the men. The sharks were rubbing their backs along the raft bottoms. Louis's arm was still draped over the side of his raft, his hand resting on Phil's forehead. Under Louis's hand, Phil drifted to sleep, attended by the sensation of sharks scraping down the lengths of his back. Wow, no thinking. In the next raft, Louis, too, fell asleep. Remember, there's 2 rafts, so they can be in both of them at the same time. Mac was alone in his wakefulness, his mind spinning with fear. Right? Remember, Mac isn't injured, but he's mentally really traumatized from the crash, and he's not doing well. Grasping at an addled resolution, meaning his resolution's been shaken. He's not holding on to his ability to reason and his desire to keep living. He began to stir. And on that note, we pause chapter 12.